Esther chapter 1. In the days of Ahasuerus, the same Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. During this time, King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom in the palace of Shushan. In the 3rd year of his reign, he hosted a grand feast for all his princes and servants, including the officials of Persia and Media, as well as the nobles and governors from the various provinces who were in attendance. This feast showcased the wealth and splendor of his magnificent kingdom and his majestic glory, lasting for a total of 180 days. Once these festivities concluded, the king organized a 7-day feast for all the people present at the palace in Shushan, from the greatest to the least. This banquet took place in the courtyard of the king's garden. The decor featured hangings of white, green, and blue, secured with fine linen and purple cords to silver rings and marble pillars. The couches were made of gold and silver, resting on a floor adorned with red, blue, white, and black marble. They served drinks in vessels of gold, each unique in its design, and provided an abundance of royal wine, all in accordance with the king's generosity. The king issued a decree that allowed each person to drink as they pleased, in accordance with the law, without any compulsion. This was a directive given to all the officials of his palace. Meanwhile, Queen Vashti also hosted a feast for the women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the king's heart was filled with wine and merriment, he commanded his eunuchs, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, who served in his presence, to bring Queen Vashti before him, wearing her royal crown, to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was indeed lovely. However, Queen Vashti refused to obey the king's command, which was delivered by his eunuchs. This greatly angered the king, and his fury burned within him. In response, the king sought the counsel of wise men who understood the laws and judgments, as was his custom. Among these wise men were Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king and held the highest positions in the kingdom. The king inquired, "What should we do according to the law with Queen Vashti because she did not obey the king's command, delivered by his eunuchs?" Memucan, one of the wise men, answered before the king and the princes, saying, "Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king but also all the princes and all the people in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this matter will be known to all women, causing them to despise their husbands when they hear that King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she refused. Likewise, the wives of Persia and Media will respond to their husbands in the same manner today because they have heard about the actions of Queen Vashti. There will be widespread contempt and anger. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree be issued, written in the laws of the Persians and Medes, which cannot be altered, stating that Queen Vashti shall never again come before King Ahasuerus, and the king should grant her royal position to another who is more worthy. When the king's decree is published throughout his vast empire, for it is indeed extensive, all wives, regardless of their status, will honor their husbands." The proposal found favor with both the king and the princes. King Ahasuerus acted upon Memucan's advice and sent letters to all the provinces in the kingdom, addressing each people in their own language. The letters decreed that every man should be the master in his own house, and they were sent out in various languages throughout the kingdom. Esther chapter 2. After these events, when King Ahasuerus' anger had subsided, he remembered what Vashti had done and the decree that had been issued against her. The king's servants, who attended to him, suggested, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the citadel of Susa, to the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch and overseer of the women. Let them be given their beauty treatments. Then the young woman who pleases the king shall become queen in place of Vashti." This proposal pleased the king, and he acted accordingly. In Susa, there was a certain Jew named Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. He had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been taken into exile with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Mordecai had raised his cousin Hadassah, also known as Esther, as his own daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. This young woman was lovely and beautiful, and when her parents had died, Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter. When the king's order and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered in Susa to be placed under the care of Haggai, Esther was also taken to the king's palace, under Haggai's charge, keeper of the women. Esther pleased him, and she received his favor. He quickly provided her with her beauty treatments, and gave her 7 maids from the king's palace. He also assigned her and her maids the best place in the women's house. Esther had not revealed her people or her family background, for Mordecai had instructed her not to. Mordecai walked daily in front of the court of the women's house to learn how Esther was doing and what would happen to her. When it was each young woman's turn to go into King Ahasuerus after the 12 months of preparation, which consisted of 6 months of myrrh and 6 months of perfumes and other preparations for women, she would go to the king in the evening, and in the morning she would return to the second harem under the supervision of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch and guardian of the concubines. She would not go to the king again unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When Esther's turn came to go to the king, the daughter of Abihail, Mordecai's uncle, who had taken her as his own daughter, she requested nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch and guardian of the women, advised. Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevath, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she found favor and kindness in his sight more than all the other virgins. He placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in Vashti's place. Then the king held a great banquet for all his officials and servants, Esther's banquet. He also granted a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. While Mordecai sat at the king's gate, Esther had still not revealed her kindred or her people, just as Mordecai had instructed her. She continued to obey Mordecai's guidance, as she had done when he was raising her. In those days, as Mordecai sat at the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, who guarded the entrance, became angry and plotted to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Mordecai learned of their plot and informed Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king on Mordecai's behalf. When an investigation was made and the matter was confirmed, both men were hanged on a gallows, and it was recorded in the royal chronicles before the king. Esther chapter 3. Following these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and elevated him, placing his seat above all the other princes who served the king. All the king's servants at the royal gate would bow down and pay respect to Haman, as the king had commanded. However, Mordecai neither bowed nor showed him reverence. The king's servants at the gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" As they spoke to him daily and he did not heed their words, they informed Haman to see whether Mordecai's actions would stand, as he had revealed to them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or show him reverence, he became filled with wrath. He considered it beneath him to harm Mordecai alone, for Mordecai's people had been shown to him. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people to whom Mordecai belonged. In the 1st month, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus' reign, Haman cast that is, the lot, before him day by day and month by month until the 12th month, the month of Adar. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their customs are different from those of all other people. They do not keep the king's laws, therefore, it is not fitting for the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the officials for deposit in the royal treasury." The king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The silver and the people are given to you, do with them as you please." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and everything Haman had commanded was written to the king's satraps, the governors of every province, and the officials of every people in each province, according to its script, and every people in their own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of the decree was issued as law in every province, and proclaimed to all the peoples, so that they would be prepared for that day. The couriers left, spurred by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was in confusion. Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had happened, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the middle of the city. There, he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the king's gate because no one was allowed to enter the king's gate dressed in sackcloth. In every province where the king's command and decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, wailed, and many put on sackcloth and ashes. Esther's maids and chamberlains informed her of this. The queen was greatly distressed, and she sent clothes to Mordecai to remove his sackcloth, but he refused to accept them. Esther then called for Hattak, one of the king's chamberlains assigned to her, and gave him a message for Mordecai to find out what was happening and why. Hattak went to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him about all that had occurred, including the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave Hattak a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, instructing him to show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go before the king to plead for her people. Hattak returned to Esther and relayed Mordecai's words. Esther sent a message back to Mordecai. Mordecai's response to Esther was as follows. Do not think that because you are in the king's palace, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Esther instructed Mordecai. Go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went and carried out all that Esther had commanded him to do. Esther chapter 5. On the 3rd day, Esther donned her royal attire and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's throne room. King Ahasuerus was seated on his royal throne inside the palace, opposite the entrance. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she found favor in his eyes, and he extended the golden scepter in his hand toward her. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king inquired, What do you desire, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted to you. Esther replied, If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. The king then ordered, Hurry, summon Haman so that he may do as Esther has requested. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the wine banquet, the king asked Esther, What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. Esther answered, saying, My petition and request are this. If I have found favor in the king's sight, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, may the king and Haman join me tomorrow at another banquet that I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Delighted, Haman left the banquet that day with a joyful heart. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, unmoved and refusing to show him respect, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Despite his anger, Haman restrained himself and went home. There, he summoned his friends and his wife, Zeresh. Haman proudly recounted his wealth, the size of his family, and all the ways the king had honored and promoted him, elevating him above the king's princes and servants. Furthermore, Haman boasted, "Even Queen Esther invited no one but me to accompany the king to the banquet she prepared, and tomorrow I am invited again with the king." However, Haman added in frustration, "Yet all of this means nothing to me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." In response, Zeresh and his friends advised him, "Build a gallows 50 cubits high, and tomorrow ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go to the banquet with the king in high spirits." Haman found this suggestion pleasing, so he ordered the gallows to be constructed. Esther chapter 6. On that particular night, King Ahasuerus found himself unable to sleep. He ordered the book of records of the Chronicles to be brought and read to him. As the records were read, it was discovered that Mordecai had previously reported a plot by two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthana and Teresh, who had conspired to harm King Ahasuerus. The king inquired, "What honor and recognition has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this act?" His attendants replied, "Nothing has been done for him." King Ahasuerus then asked, "Who is in the court?" At that moment, Haman had arrived in the outer court of the king's palace, intending to speak with the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared. The king's servants informed him, "Haman is waiting in the court." The king instructed, "Let him come in." Haman entered, and the king inquired, "What should be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" Haman, thinking the king meant to honor him, replied in his heart, "Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?" So Haman responded to the king, saying, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let the royal clothing be brought, which the king wears, and the horse on which the king rides, along with the royal crown placed on his head. Let the clothing and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes. Then let them clothe the man whom the king desires to honor, place him on the horse, and lead him through the city streets, proclaiming, 'Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king desires to honor.'" The king then instructed Haman, "Hurry, take the clothing and the horse as you have suggested, and do this for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not leave out anything you have mentioned." Haman took the royal clothing and the horse, dressed Mordecai, and paraded him through the city streets on horseback, with an official proclamation declaring, "This is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to his post at the king's gate, while Haman rushed home, deeply humiliated and with his head covered in mourning. Haman recounted to his wife Zeresh and his friends everything that had befallen him. His wise men and Zeresh, his wife, cautioned him, saying, "If Mordecai is indeed of Jewish descent, and you have begun to fall before him, you will not prevail against him, you will surely be defeated by him." As they were still speaking with Haman, the king's chamberlains arrived to escort Haman to the banquet that Queen Esther had prepared. Esther chapter 7. So the king and Haman joined Queen Esther for the banquet. On the second day of the wine banquet, King Ahasuerus once again asked Esther, "What is your request, Queen Esther?" "It shall be granted to you. And what is your wish?" "It shall be fulfilled, even to half the kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases you, spare my life, and the lives of my people. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be annihilated, killed, and destroyed. If we had only been sold as slaves and maidservants, I would have kept silent, as the enemy's harm would not have justified troubling the king." King Ahasuerus then asked Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who would dare to do such a thing?" Esther answered, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." At this, Haman became terrified before the king and queen. In his anger, King Ahasuerus left the wine banquet and went into the palace garden. Haman, realizing the gravity of the situation, stood up to plead for his life from Queen Esther, as he saw that the king had decided his fate. When the king returned from the palace garden to the wine banquet, he found Haman fallen on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own palace?" As the words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. One of the chamberlains, Harbona, spoke up before the king, saying, "Look, there is a gallows 50 cubits high that Haman had prepared for Mordecai, who spoke well of the king, standing at Haman's house." The king ordered, "Hang him on it." So Haman was hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's anger subsided. Esther chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus granted Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Mordecai came before the king, as Esther had informed him. The king removed his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. Esther then appointed Mordecai over Haman's house. Esther once again spoke before the king, falling at his feet and pleading with tears to revoke the evil plan devised by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter toward Esther, and she stood before him, saying, "If it pleases the king, if I have found favor in his sight, and if the matter seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters that Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces." Esther continued, "For how can I bear to see the evil that will come upon my people? Or how can I endure to witness the destruction of my kindred?" King Ahasuerus responded to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he sought to harm the Jews. You may also write for the Jews in the king's name and seal it with the king's ring, for a document written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So, on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, known as Sivan, the king's scribes were summoned, and Mordecai's instructions were written to the Jews, the officials, the governors, and rulers of the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Each province received the decree in its own script and language, including the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in King Ahasuerus' name, sealed the decree with the king's ring, and sent it by messengers on horseback, riding on royal horses, mules, camels, and young dromedaries. This decree allowed the Jews in every city to gather and defend themselves, destroying any force or province that would attack them, including women and children, and to take their possessions as plunder. This was to occur on a single day in all of King Ahasuerus' provinces, the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar. The decree was made public in every province, giving the Jews the opportunity to stand up against their enemies. Messengers, urged by the king's command, swiftly delivered the decree from the royal palace in Shushan. Mordecai left the king's presence in royal attire, wearing blue and white with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. The city of Shushan rejoiced and was filled with gladness. Throughout every province and city, wherever the king's decree was proclaimed, the Jews celebrated with joy and gladness. They had a feast and a day of great rejoicing, and many people from the surrounding lands became Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Esther chapter 9. In the 12th month, known as Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and decree were set to be executed, the day when the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the situation was reversed, and the Jews gained the upper hand. Throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the Jews assembled in their cities to defend themselves against those who sought to harm them. No one could stand against them because a great fear of the Jews had fallen upon the people. The rulers of the provinces, the governors, and the king's officers all helped the Jews because they were afraid of Mordecai, who had become increasingly powerful in the king's house. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, inflicting slaughter and destruction as they pleased upon those who hated them. In Shushan, the capital, they killed 500 men. Among the slain in Shushan were Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Portha, Adalia, Ariditha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vajazatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. However, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. King Ahasuerus inquired from Queen Esther, The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, along with Haman's 10 sons. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? What is your petition now? It will be granted. What is your further request? It will also be fulfilled. Esther replied, If it pleases the king, let the Jews in Shushan be allowed to do tomorrow what they did today. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. The king ordered it to be done, and the decree was issued in Shushan. Haman's 10 sons were hanged. The Jews in Shushan assembled on the 14th day of Adar and killed 300 men, but they did not take the plunder. In the other provinces of King Ahasuerus, the Jews gathered to defend themselves, and they gained relief from their enemies, killing 75,000 of their foes. However, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. On the 13th day of Adar, they rested and celebrated with a feast and joy. The Jews of Shushan did the same on the 14th day, and they rested on the 15th day, making it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in the villages, living in unwalled towns, celebrated the 14th day of Adar with joy, feasting, and sending portions to one another. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, establishing an annual observance of the 14th and 15th days of Adar. These days were to commemorate the Jews' rest from their enemies, their month of turning sorrow into joy, and their mourning into a holiday of feasting and joy. They were to exchange gifts with one another and provide for the poor. The Jews accepted Mordecai's instructions and the tradition they had begun, following Mordecai's written commands. Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite and the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted to annihilate the Jews. He cast a lot to determine the day for their destruction. But when Esther appeared before the king, he commanded through letters that Haman's wicked plan, which he had devised against the Jews, should fall upon his own head. Haman and his sons were to be hanged on the gallows. These days of Purim were named after the lot. And because of all that was written in this letter and because of all they had seen and experienced in this regard, the Jews established a custom and tradition for themselves, their descendants, and all who would join them, ensuring that these days of Purim would never be forgotten among the Jews or their descendants. Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, with full authority, confirmed the second letter of Purim, which Mordecai had written to establish the observance of these days. He sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of King Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, instructing them to observe the days of Purim at their appointed times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed. They had established these practices for themselves and their descendants, including the observance of fasting and lamentation. The decree of Esther confirmed these regulations for the observance of Purim, and it was recorded in the book. Esther chapter 10. King Ahasuerus imposed a tax on the land and the islands of the sea. The details of his authority, strength, and the account of Mordecai's greatness, to which the king elevated him, are recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew held a position second only to King Ahasuerus, and he was highly regarded among the Jewish people. He was widely accepted by his brethren and worked diligently to promote the welfare of his people, seeking peace for all his descendants.